Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we speak openly about what it really takes to connect people at work. From internal comms and knowledge sharing to the messiness of change and the rise of AI, we go beyond best practices to unpack what's working, what's not, and what's worth rethinking. Our host, Bourgeault-Trickey, has spent over 10 years in internal comms, building and launching intranets for organizations in telecoms and finance. He now leads client services at Happeo, where he's helped over 120 businesses across the globe create and grow engaging digital workplaces that drive organizational goals and objectives. If you care about how people in your organization share, learn, and adapt, this is your show. And if you're looking for a modern digital HQ, you can find us at happeo.com.
Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we explore the messy, brilliant, and occasionally unfiltered world of internal comms, knowledge sharing, and digital transformation. I'm your host and Happeo's Principal of Client Services, Bourgeault-Trickey. And today we're exploring the art of internal comms, plus how AI and video are shaping the stories organizations tell. Today's guest is Roxanne Deevey, the owner and chief strategist of Deevey Strategic Communications, a bilingual comms and marketing consultancy based in Ottawa, Canada. As an accredited business communicator, Roxanne has built a solid reputation for delivering quality content, particularly within the education and healthcare nonprofit sectors. She's an award-winning communicator, a recipient of 2 Gold Quill awards from the International Association of Business Communicators, and her team also earned an Excel Award from IABC Ottawa for her work at the French Catholic School Board in the nation's capital. Thanks for joining, Roxanne.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Great. So we'll dive into our unmuted moments. And so the first question I wanted to ask was, what's something people get wrong about communicators?
I think something that people get wrong about communicators is that communications is a nice to have, and it's not an integral part of the organization. And, that it is actually a really important function of any organization, no matter what the size of it is.
How do you tend to get around that kind of question if it comes up, or, if you're sort of presented in a situation like that?
Well, the thing is when it does come up, it's usually around budget planning time, when organizations are looking to be leaner or whatever else. And then, they often will turn to the one function in the organization that may not be the core business. And of course, most of the time, unless you're an actual marketing agency or a communications agency, well, communications is the one that they tend to turn to. And I always, at first, it always kind of made me feel a little bit confused, and I would take it personally and think, well, is it because I don't do good enough work? Is it because my team isn't competent enough? But then I realized that no, it's because people don't understand that without communications, a lot of their projects and initiatives actually won't get off the ground. Mm-hmm. So it's really just about raising awareness within the organization about how important it is for communications to be part and parcel of any project or organizational initiative. Mm-hmm. From the beginning all the way to the end, and not just as an afterthought.
Yeah, I guess like from that perspective of us being more sort of upfront and direct about it, what's something in the comms world you think we need to finally say out loud that's been muted for too long?
In the comms world, I think basically it's to ask the right questions, even if they're tough questions. Ask tough questions like why this, why now, and to learn to say no nicely. But to learn to say no by asking the right questions, and by also asking, how does this align with the organization's strategic plan? Because, we constantly get bombarded with all kinds of service requests, and it's not always easy to figure out where it all fits in the overall vision, organizational vision, or even short or medium term strategy in terms of positioning the organization and that sort of thing, whether it's with external audiences or even more so internal audiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's almost that you got to ask 3 questions. You got to get really deep into it to really start to understand what's going on, right?
Absolutely.
So with the challenges that come with this work, what's the moment in your job that makes all the chaos worth it?
I think it's hard to really pinpoint that one, but I think it's when at the end of the day, you feel like people got it. people understood. I think that's when it is, when people aren't still bombarding you with requests for more information and what is this, and there's typically within any organization we kind of have our canaries in the mine, those few people within the organization who tend to be the rabble rousers, the ones who will fill your inbox with those kind of, unfortunately annoying emails where they're really questioning what you're doing. But I think those people are important because even though they can be somewhat annoying sometimes, because we have very busy schedules and don't necessarily have time to answer all their emails, but they are important because they're the canary in the mine. Like I said earlier, they're the ones who, it's kind of like a radio call-in show, one call, one opinion can represent, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of people who have the same opinion. So those people shouldn't be discounted. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Maybe I went on a little bit of a red herring there. But I think at the end of the day, if those people seem to be satisfied with how things went and aren't coming up with follow-up questions after questions and challenging things, then probably you did a good job.
No, I think you definitely answered the question, because it's really that case of sort of like being able to get through to the detractor or get through to the resistor, and then you really know that you kind of really made the difference, as opposed to people who might be a little more easygoing and just more able to be kind of convinced, right? So
right, and I mean, I'm not naive. I know that there are some of those detractors that will never be happy, but often there are people within that group who are actually quite reasonable and rational, and those people are actually very helpful sometimes.
Yeah. Thinking back to this idea of being a representative of a bigger story, what's a small internal change that you've made that has had a surprisingly big impact in the past?
Well, this is going to sound very tactical and maybe somewhat ordinary, but message mapping. I started message mapping with my team after attending, a one-day kind of training session on how the message map works. And I'm talking about Stephen Covey's, I think it's Covey, I forget now. No, it's not. I'll get back to you on that one. But anyway, it's a message map. It's basically a way to structure your key messaging, so that you have your three main key messages at the top of the map. And then for each message, you have 3 points of information to support that key message. And I find that just organizing your thoughts before writing a speech, writing a news release, writing a sensitive letter, or even delivering difficult news to your team. I've found that tool has been indispensable. And when I started using that tool internally within my organization, members of the executive team actually became quite fond of that tool because it helped them as well. It took a little bit of training. It was a bit of a change in how we did things, but it was so much easier to use because it was more of a memory aid, because, the human brain can only retain a certain number of words or messages in one communication. So you take out all of the, the adjectives and the adverbs and all that stuff, and you really get down to the basic message of what you want to say. And you put it down in that message map, and it's so much easier to remember and to speak in a way that is much more natural than to be looking down at, briefing lines or whatever else, where you kind of have to figure out where is that little piece of that information I was supposed to give. So it's a really great tool, and it's something that anybody can look up on YouTube or whatever. It's easy to find. I don't think there are any copyrights on it, so it's something that you can even find templates for online. And I found that was the one thing that just made communication so much easier. Everybody was reading off of the same song sheet. We were all agreed on what the actual messages were. The only inconvenience, I would say, is when you're in an organization where everything has to be vetted by 12 people. Sure. And that completely defeats the purpose of a message map, because then all of a sudden you've got those adjectives and those jargony words in there that you really want to stay away from, because, jargon is the least efficient way of communicating with people. So, you really have to raise awareness within the organization to say, this is the message map, this is how it works. And clear, simple language is how people remember what we're saying. You know, and if you want people to retain your messages, then you need to keep them really, really simple. So I think that once I got that through to people, it was amazing, the change. It really made for a tool that a lot of people could use. It didn't necessarily have to go through comms every single time, although it's preferable that it go through comms if it's something a bit, you know, touchier. But it was the one tool that really made a difference.
No, that's great. I think it's definitely leaning into that, like the concept of rule of thirds. So you're sort of really tapping into the mind's way of working, and then I really like that idea of having that visual hierarchy. So I'll have to check that out and see how that looks. That's a great idea. Yeah. So you actually do some consultancy work as part of what you do as an internal comms professional. And so I was wondering, you know, where do you think organizations generally overestimate themselves when it comes to internal communications?
You know, that's a tough question. I think that organizations tend to, and maybe I'm talking more about executive committee and the C-suite, they tend to think that de facto employees are going to care about what they're doing, that informing employees about what they're doing is communicating. And that's not necessarily the case. You kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of the employee who might be working in finance or, you know, whatever other department, who really just wants to get their work done. And maybe they don't really care about the strategic planning process that the bosses are doing. So, you know, I think they overestimate employee, I wouldn't say loyalty, but more just employees' interest in what the higher ups are doing. I think that's a common mistake. And so you really have to put yourself, as a good communicator, in any case, you always have to put yourself in your audience's shoes. So what about this thing that the C-suite is doing is actually relevant to the employee? And how can we drive the information home in a way that will pique their interest and then keep them interested?
Yeah, it's definitely like starting with the audience, or the what's in it for me is always something that might be overestimated. So that's a great way of putting it. When you're working on these projects, is there sort of an early red flag that might tell you that a project is going to be harder than, you know, maybe the clients expected or what you expected?
Yeah, I think a lack of clarity on what success looks like at the end of the day. I think that's a really good indicator. So I always have a preset, I guess, list of basic questions that I ask to really hone down on, you know, what is it exactly we want to achieve here? And, you know, so the objectives, who the key audiences are, what success looks like before we get into the tactical piece. Because often that's what happens, is they think they need a video or a new website or whatever. And then you're kind of going, well, okay, but can we back up a little bit? Can we zoom out? You know, and I think as communicators, that's our role, is to ask those tough questions so that at the end of the day, we can bring them around to realizing that maybe the video isn't necessary. Maybe there's a simpler way to do this, or maybe it is the video as opposed to the website, you know, but kind of ask those questions to get people thinking. So, you know, there's a good dose of humility in all of that as well, because, you know, it's accepting that you may not have all the answers. So you want to discover the answers with the client, and you want to help them reflect on what it is exactly that they're looking for at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's easy to get kind of caught up in their almost like desire to sort of get moving, right? And to be able to kind of slow the train down a little bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you could remove sort of like one barrier that you are seeing across the clients you're working with, do you have something in mind? Like, what would it be and why would you want to remove it?
Barrier. I don't know. I think approvals processes are probably the one thing that really, I wouldn't necessarily slow down our work, because sometimes it's good to slow down and to take the time to reflect and think about what it is that we're doing here. But I think approvals processes need to be simplified because sometimes they muddle the communication. Like I was saying earlier with the message mapping, if you have 10 people looking over your key messages, and then at the end of this approvals process, nobody knows what we're talking about anymore, then it's going to fail miserably. So it's really working with people to say, okay, how many people need to be involved in the approvals process? Can we simplify that? And also just to raise awareness about the fact that communicators are experts in their fields. And so writing things up as a committee never works. So, give us the objectives, give us the key audiences, give us, the high level, what it is you want to accomplish. And then give us some time to work on the wordsmithing, and we'll come back to you and validate. But don't try to write it up as a committee or give us an approvals process that's impossible to help us achieve the goals that you've laid out. I think that would be the main thing for me.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe something to kind of as others are maybe starting different consultant work with different clients, to think about that as maybe a basis is how do you set up the actual work going forward. And
I think what I find kind of, I don't know, sometimes it's disappointing sometimes to see that there are really great communicators working within organizations that unfortunately have to bring in a consultant to convince the higher ups or I shouldn't say higher ups, to convince their colleagues that this is how things should be done. It's almost like because they're within the organization, they're not given the credibility that they deserve. And I always think that's kind of sad, because then I'm brought in as a consultant, and sometimes, the communicator in chief or the director, whoever it is, will say, I've been trying to drive that point home for a couple of years now, and thank you for coming in and telling them the same thing, and I always think that's kind of sad.
Yeah, I mean, it could be the case that, they weren't listening, but it also might be the case that, if they're hearing that consistency, then maybe it's sort of the tipping point for them a little bit. And of course, there's always that piece around, if you're paying for something, suddenly it's worth more, right? So it's a bit of a challenge. I know I've experienced that too, and I've seen it, and it's one of those things that hopefully, by doing more of these kinds of communication efforts and podcasts like this, we're able to get the message out there that those people that are already at your org have a lot to offer. So,
and sometimes when I'm working with a director of communications or someone else who works in communications, I'll say, is there something in the strategy that would help you? What is the one thing that I could do, that I could add to the strategy that would help you in your work? And I think it's important that consultants work very, very closely with the communications function within the organization, because ultimately it's the communications function that's going to have to carry it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess part of this is also like sort of showing your work and maybe having to take on the role of self-promotion, which a lot of communicators don't necessarily sort of easily fit into, I think. I'm wondering, from your standpoint, can you maybe think of an example or a moment when better communications changed the outcome of a project or an organization that you were working with?
Yeah, so we were confronted with a challenge within the school board where I worked, where we had a lot of newly arriving Canadians coming into the schools, and we were sensing that there was some resistance to these families coming from other cultures and other countries, and I think people were feeling a little overwhelmed and seeing it as a negative thing. And so we put together a campaign to raise awareness about the importance of being inclusive and being open to other cultures, and the fact that, not everyone that comes into the school system will speak the language as well as you do, and that's okay. And we're putting structures into place to help these kids succeed. And we kind of sat around a table and we brainstormed, and we realized that having a moralizing tone with people would just piss them off. Excuse the expression, but that's, so we needed to find a way to do it that would actually be more engaging and more compelling. And we decided to use recognition as a way to raise awareness. So instead of telling people what to do, we chose to have a campaign where we would actually recognize what's being done that's great. And so it was called grâce à moi, which loosely translated in English means thanks to me. So it was thanks to me, thanks to you. So for instance, we would have posters that would say, thanks to you, my child can speak French with her grandmother. Or, thanks to you, I feel like I'm part of a community. Or, so then, and it just caught on. It was just wild. And we didn't even use really sophisticated props. We had like these little pins that said, thanks to me on them. And we couldn't believe it. The schools kept ordering more and more of these pins because all of the staff wanted these pins to say, thanks to me, I'm doing good stuff. I'm doing stuff that's making people feel included and making people feel at home. And so it was a resounding success. And you mentioned in the intro about winning awards, and actually our school board won a couple of Gold Quill awards for that particular campaign. Because of, it was a campaign that showed a lot of really positive results. And we used the metrics that we needed to before and after the campaign to see if people actually felt like they had more buy-in and like they were part of the school community and that sort of thing. So it was really nice to see the results and how it all worked out in the end. In fact, we other school boards tried to replicate the same campaign because they had heard about it. So that was really rewarding.
That's great. Yeah, I could definitely see that as a really nice way to be able to kind of bring everybody together, feel like they're all part of the same team, driving those changes. And it's something as subtle as a pin can kind of make all the difference of sort of putting everybody on that same team. So that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Speaking of kind of the influence side of things, what's one conversation you find yourself having over and over again with sort of like an executive leadership group?
Conversation I find myself having over and over again. Well, it goes back to just kind of having clear objectives when people will ask for a communication strategy, and sometimes they don't really need what they think they need in terms of a strategy. They might want an overarching strategy because the board of directors or the school board trustees decided that what they need is a strategy. And that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's really just asking the right questions. I know I keep coming back to that, but it's asking the right questions and asking what the end game is, and not just developing another document just to tick a box because you were asked to develop a document. So it's really just that, asking the right questions, and is this the best way to achieve the goal?
There was the example you just gave us was sort of a great example of a bit of like change management almost within the organization. I'm wondering if maybe are there, like what's an example of things that organizations still consistently overlook if you think more broadly about the other organizations you're working with?
Things that organizations consistently overlook, I think one of them, and it depends on the organization, of course, we're not all cut from the same cloth, but the perception that consultation is just about holding a public meeting or a town hall and giving people an opportunity to voice their concerns, and then just ticking that box and saying, yep, consultation, check, we consulted, but not actually listening. And not actually taking people's feedback into consideration when developing whatever it is they're developing, whether it be a project or a report or whatever else. I think that's the one thing. I think it's disingenuous, and I think it's one of my pet peeves. I think is calling it consultation when really it's not. It's to me a consultation is a two-way process. And sometimes just giving people an opportunity to express themselves, but not take into account their opinions or their concerns, is a recipe sometimes for failure, because you know, if you want something to work, if you want buy-in, then you have to take your stakeholders' concerns seriously. And unfortunately, I think some organizations sometimes want to go too fast and kind of do that consultation piece very, very rapidly and don't necessarily use it as a building block.
Yeah, it comes up, and you hear it in other forms like survey fatigue and things like that. And I like to think of it more as like it's a fatigue to the fact that nothing comes from the surveys is what's going on there.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely an important piece. And like you said, it can be almost like a multiplier of disengagement. Of we're upset, and then you brought us all together to grieve about things, and then nothing happened. Now everybody's kind of thinking the same thing, right? So
right, and that's why it's so important to circle back and to let people know what came of it at the end.
Yeah. Do you tend to have a sort of a way of approaching that as far as like a, you know, like the maybe it's an ideal state, but how you would sort of condense down what you're hearing, or a best way to sort of communicate next steps?
Oh, you know, it's variable. It all depends. Sometimes it's not so much about consultation as maybe focus groups, or, you know, there are different ways to consult. I think what's important is to find the right way for that particular situation or that particular initiative.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. It's sort of a bit of a rhetorical question, because it's just to say, you know, I could see executives thinking, okay, well, we just do this. You know,
Yeah,
in reality.
right. Whatever's easiest, right?
Yeah.
The path of least resistance, but it's not necessarily the best path. And I think from a crisis communications point of view, I read somewhere that 60% of crises are foreseeable, which, you know, there are very few that actually come from, you know, circumstances that over which you have no control, such as natural disasters and that sort of thing. So when you consider that 60% of crises are foreseeable, that means that we could do a much better job of reading our environment and listening to our stakeholders.
Yep. Well, I wanted to switch up a little bit and talk about video production with you, because I know that it is something that's sort of part of your background, and I haven't really had anybody with that expertise on the show yet. So when you started in that traditional television production, and now you're kind of working with AI video tools from our previous discussion. What was the moment you realized the industry was kind of shifting, and what pulled you into this new direction?
Well, you have to understand that I was a journalist not before, but kind of during the whole process of digitization of video and that sort of thing, and you know, editing becoming something that could be done on a desktop, and you know, and even in those early days, you had to have a lot of know-how to do desktop editing. This software was cumbersome. You needed all kinds of servers behind it just to, you know, it was just crazy complicated. And I think to me, it's when I realized that I could do desktop editing myself on my PC, and that you know, I could even just edit video like you could edit text. You know, I mean, there is software out there that can do that. And I just thought, wow, this is so awesome, because it makes it so much more accessible. And I think we're seeing it, you know, with TikTok and, you know, all the platforms that exist where people can just kind of put out their own little videos and entertain people with the funniest things, you know, sometimes very mundane. And, you know, and people can't seem to get enough of it. So that's when I realized that video had become so much more democratic in a sense, or, you know, accessible, popular, democratized. Yeah.
Well, and there's still to be said, though, the expertise that you've gained over the course of all of this is still obviously very relevant in a world increasingly moving towards video as a main communication format. What skills or instincts from your TV production background still give you an edge when you're creating maybe like AI supported video today?
Well, I think AI will never replace how could I put it? I think AI is a good tool to help with your work, but it will never replace the work of you know, good sound research and fact checking and storytelling. You know, knowing which questions are the right questions to ask according to that particular context and that sort of thing. AI hasn't reached that point yet, and I don't know if it ever will. I attended a workshop on AI and audiovisual in Montreal, and it was really interesting because the people who were there, I could tell, felt very threatened by AI, and there's reason to feel threatened. I mean, with what's come out about deep fakes and that sort of thing, there is great reason for concern. But there's also, AI as a really interesting tool to help people with their work. I mean, we're dealing with smaller and smaller teams, and AI can certainly help with the drudgery, the news release that can be written so much more quickly now with the help of AI. And I'm saying news release, that may not be the best example, but any kind of communications document that could be a bit more mundane, but the fact of the matter is you still need to have a clear idea of what your communications objectives are and your key messages are. And AI can help with that. I've written short scenarios for videos with AI, and it was absolutely amazing. Mm-hmm. But the fundamentals were there. I clearly laid out what my key messages were, what my communications objectives were, as well as, just what the end game was, in terms of what we wanted people to do at the end of the day, what the call to action was. So, those fundamental pieces have to be there in order for AI to be helpful. Otherwise, it's garbage in, garbage out, regardless.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess you kind of pointed to it there. Everything's sort of moving really quick, and there is sort of that need, like, to draw the line, I guess, between almost like the automation versus the concept of sort of preserving the human craft of storytelling behind it all. Like, is there a way for you to kind of separate those things, or to kind of see the difference between the two?
The difference between storytelling and automation?
Yeah, like the idea that the AI is sort of just creating based on, these prompts, for instance, versus sort of preserving the overall, like, the way in which we tell stories as being its own sort of thing,
Yeah, I think it is its own sort of thing. And I think AI is going to become better and better at telling stories. But it'll only become better if we provide better input. So yeah, like I said, it's garbage in, garbage out. So the better quality input, the better the AI is going to be at helping people do their work. But we have to, of course, be very critical of AI and how it's being used. And I think as a society, this is something that we have to keep on looking at. Obviously, our roles as communicators are going to have to evolve and change. But I think at the end of the day, when it comes to that kind of the high executive reasoning, that kind of process of what part of the story is relevant in this particular context, mm-hmm. and all of that's something that belongs to us. And I think that we're going to better be able to do that important kind of work and leave the drudgery to those AI tools.
Yeah, no, I like the way you put that. It made me think about the fact that there's always going to be, the intention of all of this is to have that human as the audience, and you bring that to the creation process, even if you're working with that tool, right?
Right, because in any really great communication, there's the facts, there's the head, the stuff that we need to know, but there's also the heart and the emotions, and that's really where you kind of get in there and you interest people and you engage them, and you always have to have that kind of reading of the environment and what's going on and why is this relevant right now. You have to have a really good sense of that in order to tell the story in a way that is compelling.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's a good transition to some of the closing questions I had here. I wanted to kind of ask around from the human side of things, as far as the consulting work and the internal comms work. What's one piece of comms advice that you give clients that seems simple but turns out to be surprisingly hard for the organizations to do?
I think it's to get away from the jargon and, just speak in simple language. Mm-hmm. And jargon is something that we use because it makes us feel important and it makes us feel like experts, but it's not a great way to communicate, because people outside of that circle of experts or even of aficionados, people who work in that milieu. Outside of that, no one understands what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So using plain language is not dumbing down, and I hear that a lot. I hear a lot about, so the media is dumbing things down, or whoever is dumbing things down. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Yes, there is a certain amount of dumbing down, but I don't think plain language is dumbing down. I think plain language is just helping people understand. And that's what we need to do as communicators. We need to help people understand, because there's so much information being thrown at everybody that, at some point people they reach a saturation point. They can't take in any more information. So, there's an expression in French, vulgariser, which means to make complicated information accessible. And I think that's our main role, is just to make things easy for people to understand by using plain language and language that is compelling and engaging for people.
Yeah, I'm sure anybody who's spent time trying to craft really good messaging and make it as sort of simple and concise as possible will know that that's definitely not an easy task. So yeah.
No, and it's really not an easy task within organizations that are very dependent on their technical language and their highfalutin words, and and convincing these people that it's important to use plain language. Yeah, I mean, we have to take into account, of course, the audience. I mean, if we're speaking to an audience of experts, that's different. But so you just have to always keep your audience in mind.
Yeah, I mean, even then, you can't assume too much, right? It could be that the jargon they're using is different from your jargon, or
exactly.
What's the bridge there for everybody?
And I think that that's important for internal communications as well. I worked for a school board, so of course, this was an organization that tended to use education jargon, but that, for internal comms, education jargon doesn't necessarily work with the people who work in facilities or the people who work in finance. So you have to be mindful of those audiences as well.
Yep. Speaking of being mindful of the audience, can you maybe give us a sense of one of your more memorable moments you've seen when employees generally felt heard or informed?
One of my memorable moments. Well, I think it's really when you kind of meet people in the hallway or in the elevator, and they give you positive feedback about something that you've communicated, and they kind of say, I get it now. I didn't get it before, but now I get it. That's always really rewarding.
Yeah, that's great. We'll kind of close out with some spicy takes and soft landings. So I wanted to start with finish this sentence. I know this is controversial, but.
I know this is controversial, but the CEO isn't necessarily the best person to give the interview on a given topic. And I know it's controversial, but sometimes there are other experts within the organization who really know their stuff and who can communicate it really well. And if you have to spoon feed it to the CEO, and that they don't really feel like they really know it, it's going to show. It's going to show in, when they talk about it. So sometimes you have to have those courageous conversations and kind of say, I think for this one, maybe we need to give it to somebody else. And that's not always easy. It's not always good for the CEO's ego to realize that they aren't necessarily the expert.
Yeah, it does go back again to this concept of the audience, though, right? It's like, to respect the audience, we want to make sure that we're giving them the best representation of ourselves. Like, let's make this happen, right? So.
Yeah.
And finally, what's one thing internal comms pros could do tomorrow that their future selves will thank them for?
Oh, gee, what could they do tomorrow that their future selves will thank them for? I think it's just kind of defending, their role within the organization, and not, you got to choose your battles, right? I mean, sometimes you got to ask yourself, am I willing to die on that hill? And sometimes you're not willing to die on that hill. But I think it's just kind of realizing which hills are worth dying on, and really standing up for yourself as an internal communicator and saying, this is important, and we need to communicate this effectively to our employees if we really want this to be credible, and if we really want buy-in. And so it's just convincing, the C-suite or the executive committee that we need to take the time to communicate this properly. And, I think that's really just defend your function. It's important. Internal comms are important, and they've been neglected for far too long.
Yeah, I think that's great. You don't want to be in that position where you're like, I wish I said something, right? So
exactly.
Definitely do that.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you being on the call today, Roxanne. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really had fun.
Great. Well, that's it for this episode of Unmuted. If you liked what you heard, rate, review, and follow, and maybe share it with a leader who could use a little inspiration. Remember, whether it's people, knowledge, or even AI video, great stories and great communication always lead the way. Thanks again, everybody. Hope to see you on the next episode.